Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda. Although the national security strategy says very little about Russia, what it does say is very, very significant because it does not treat Russia as an adversary. But we are talking about an attempt to break the European Union to absolutely shatter this institution. This is what Scott Lucas, professor of international politics at the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin, told me when commenting on the new national security strategy of the Trump administration. Scott is also professor emeritus of international politics at the University of Birmingham and editor-in-chief of EA Worldview. Does he think that Europe is, at this moment, squeezed between Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, Elon Musk, and Xi Jinping? And if so, how should it respond? Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate. Scott, the new American national security strategy is almost completely silent on the Russian threat, but it is full of ideological attacks against Europe, essentially aligning the US administration with European nationalist parties against the European Union. Former US ambassador to NATO, Ivo Dauder, called the document unserious but dangerous. On the other hand, I hear some positives from the Indo-Pacific experts. How do you assess this?
Trump administration is always difficult to evaluate because it can be chaotic and unpredictable. But I think in this case, that there's some very dangerous, if relatively coherent thought in the national security strategy. I need to say, first of all, it's not a strategy. When I talk about it being coherent, it is a worldview of certain Trump officials. So it's not a strategy like we think of the United States after World War II in terms of its geopolitical position, in terms of alliances, in terms of adversaries, in terms of linking political, economic, military activity. I've done a lot of work on those strategies as a historian, and that is not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is a worldview where, first of all, although it says very little about Russia, what it says is really, really significant because it does not treat Russia as an adversary. It does not treat it as a foe, despite what has happened with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and other examples of Russian, what we might call hybrid warfare, going back now for almost, in fact, more than a decade. Instead, it talks about strategic realignment. So the idea from these Trump people, and we'll discuss who's behind the strategy in a minute, is that they can work with the Russians, right? They can cooperate. In contrast with both the European Union and then individual European states, they're treated as a threat. So again, I want to emphasize, post-1945 U.S. troop strategy had built upon the idea of an international order where you work with Europe. Now, that U.S. approach was certainly flawed. We can certainly criticize a lot of that approach, but that was the bedrock of it. Now, these Trump people, the brief reference to NATO is that they effectively don't want NATO expansion, but then they just sort of push it aside as an organization. And then when they talk about Europe, they use racist, xenophobic language, which is not just allying with the far right in Europe. It marks out these Trump officials as being far right. And that's a very serious allegation, so I need to explain what's that.
So why do you see this that way, and about whom are we talking?
They talk about the civilizational erasure of Europe. That in itself is a very provocative term, but what do they mean by that Europe's civilization is being erased? Well, they take shots at the way that Europe, regulates free speech. This is that whole Trump folks being upset that there's a regulation on what they can say, especially over their incitement of violence. The civilizational erasure is primarily talking about the overrunning of white populations by non-white populations. And that is what we have actually seen for years as the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. It's come out from various people in Europe. It has been promoted by Germany's far-right AfD. It's been promoted by far-right French political figures such as Eric Zemmour, the former presidential candidate who was pushing it. It has been promoted by some acquaintances of Donald Trump in the past, including the former Fox TV broadcaster Tucker Carlson. There is an issue with immigration that we can discuss, and you'll know about this in Slovakia, you'll know about this elsewhere, because of the surge in immigration, because of disasters, civil wars, complete breakdown of certain societies in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, going back a generation. And we could talk about how that's affected Europe. But they are not talking about a sensible approach to immigration. They are portraying this as that white Europeans have to reclaim their civilizations. And when they mean white Europeans, they make it clear, they give the code phrase European nationalist parties. And at the same time they talk about European nationalist parties, they condemn the EU and those parties who are involved with that. Now, why I emphasize this is not just something statements they are making. There has been a move in Trump 2.0 in this administration to implement an approach which actually was being pushed by the former Trump advisor Steve Bannon in the first Trump administration. And again, you all will probably know about this, and that is Bannon would go around to far-right parties and activists and say, we want to build you up. We want to set up joint initiatives with you. And he did this in France. He's done it in Germany. He's done it in the UK. He tried to do it in Italy, but interestingly, even though Giorgia Meloni is the prime minister there, he got pushed back in Italy. Italy saw this as an affront to its sovereignty. Now they're redoubling the effort, not just with Bannon, who's on the outside of the administration, but they're redoubling the effort under J.D. Vance, the vice president. In February, Vance was at the Munich Security Conference, and you all will know about this. It got a lot of attention at the time because it was just a provocative, even insulting presentation, which effectively declared there was no alliance between the U.S. and Europe, that Europe needed to deal with its problems on its own, and that it was declining anyway. On the sidelines, Vance met the leaders of Germany's AfD. I think he met Elisa Weidel there, but I definitely know he met AfD officials there. Just after that, Elon Musk, who at that point was part of the Trump administration, did a softball interview, effectively a PR podcast with Elisa Weidel. So there was this promotion of the AfD that was taking place. There was an attempt to promote the National Rally in France, Marine Le Pen's party. There has been a sustained effort by the Trump people to put the Reform Party in the UK into power. Part of this was Musk actually calling for the overthrow of the existing Labour government and pushing that earlier this year. Part of it was American officials, including Vance, who have met with the leaders of the Reform Party, including Donald Trump's former employee, Nigel Farage. This summer, Vance was in the UK purportedly on vacation, but when he was supposedly on vacation down in an area of England I know quite well, the Cotswolds, he was meeting hard-right Conservative Party figures and Reform Party figures. And that effort was backed up by a series of Trump people coming into the UK media, especially the national outlet of the Reform Party, GB News, to say there is no free speech in the UK. The UK is being overrun by immigrants. The Labour Party is completely ineffective in power, and the Reform Party needs to be supported in dealing with these problems. I mean, and interesting enough, one of the Trumpists who came over to push this campaign was Charlie Kirk, just before he was killed, shot dead this summer. So we're not just talking about a hypothetical breaking of the alliance between the U.S. and Europe. It is broken, at least for these Trump officials, these Trump members of the Trump circle. We are not just talking about a breaking of the alliance. We're talking about an attempt to break the European Union, to absolutely shatter it as an institution. And we are talking about an attempt to ally with individual far-right parties, because the approach of the Trump camp here is you don't work multilaterally. You work bilaterally to try to get profit and to try to advance the far-right agenda of individual countries. This is happening. I mean, this is absolutely happening.
So, Scott, talking about the EU, and the European Commission has issued a fine of 120 million euros to X for breaching its transparency obligation under the Digital Services Act. Elon Musk, who owns X, reacted by saying that the EU should be abolished. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev replied to Musk that exactly that should happen. Trump called the EU fine on X a nasty one and said that Europe has to be very careful. So should the EU be concerned about such statement, basically an alliance, especially considering the adversarial approach of Trump's administration towards the EU that we already discussed?
Of course, the EU should be concerned about this effectively. I think if you want to call it a new alliance, I don't want to call it that, but at least cooperation.
At least it is a social media alliance, I would say.
It's certainly a convergence of interest, which focuses on the breakup of the EU. I mean, let's take the immediate issue, first of all, which is that EU fine of 120 million euros on Musk, because most media outlets have not actually gone into why that fine was imposed. X completely flouted the social media regulations of the EU. This is not a question of censorship. This is not a question of denying free speech. For example, what X was doing is that when Elon Musk took it over, Twitter had a verification system where if you were a professional that could be verified, whether you're a journalist, whether you're a politician, whether you're a member of an NGO, you submitted your credentials and you could have what was called the blue tick. Now, Musk scrapped that system and instead he sold verification. All you had to do was pay money to X and you got the blue tick. So it was a false scheme, falsely promoted people as being professionals when in fact they were not. Musk also got called out because X has scrapped effectively its moderation of posts, which we know that. And indeed, the EU could have gone much farther. Some people have actually pointed out quite rightly, some analysts, look, Brazil actually banned X for a time because of the risk of incitement of violence. And Musk screamed on social media about it, and Brazil stood its ground. And X had to abide by those Brazilian regulations. So the EU is doing this. But of course, Musk doesn't want to pay out the money. He doesn't want to have to put moderation in on X because it would curb the disinformation that he himself puts out. So he doesn't want to do that. So he screams about the immediate issue, but then it links up into the wider project, which is we're going to attack the EU. And it was an absolute organized firestorm of Trump camp accounts at the same time that you had Kremlin accounts and that you had far-right accounts that were coming out. And it was just a gift to the Kremlin that they could amplify what Musk and the Trump camp were saying. And it wasn't just Dmitry Medvedev. It was other Russian officials. And it was all those Russian accounts that are actually troll accounts that aren't officially acknowledged. There's a context to this. Look, in 2016, when the Russians supported the Trump campaign, and they did support the Trump campaign, and the Trump campaign knew the Russians were supporting them, and they did speak to the Russians about it. When they intervened in the U.S. election in 2016, remember, they were also intervening in European elections. They also intervened in the French elections, and the French were able to set up a firewall against that. They intervened in the German elections. They were trying to knock out Emmanuel Macron. They were trying to knock out Angela Merkel because this was part of a broader approach by the Kremlin after he got scared by the Maidan revolution in Ukraine and the loss of its pro-Moscow president Yanukovych. This was part of their fight back. It wasn't just seizing Crimea. It wasn't just splitting Ukraine. It was going after Europe and going after the European Union. Steve Bannon supported that in the first term. Other Trump administration officials supported it in the first term, but they didn't organize themselves effectively. And of course, Trump was under pressure because of that cooperation with Russia. Now in 2025, they're not under the pressure from what he did in the first term. You've got activists, disinformation activists, who say it was all a hoax. Russia never helped Trump. He's not under that pressure. Instead, he's got the space under the guise of trying to strike a peace settlement in Ukraine, of working with the Russians. And that's what's interesting. If you want to talk about why European leaders who just were in London on Monday, meeting Vladimir Zelensky, are now seeing this as being a defining moment, and I think foremost among them is Friedrich Merz, who, interestingly, the German chancellor, who actually was one of the biggest proponents of the transatlantic alliance, they see this as a defining moment because it is not just a question of defending Ukraine against a U.S.-Russian ultimatum to break up Ukraine. It is defending Europe because of the combined threat of Russian invasion and, let's call it what it is, Trump administration subversion. And it's not even subversion because it's not covert. It's actually overt as well.
Then is Europe at this moment squeezed between Trump, Putin, and Musk, and most probably also Xi Jinping? And if so, how should it react?
There is another element of the story, which means the EU is not completely squeezed here, which is that I need to talk about the Trump camp as being distinct from the Trump administration. When we talk about the Trump camp, we're talking about Vance, we're talking about his envoys, the real estate developer Steve Witkoff, his son-in-law Jared Kushner. We're talking about certain far-right officials who have political points in the administration. There is still another institutional dimension of the Trump administration with certain officials who still are upholding the idea of that U.S. institutions need to work with European institutions. And I think Secretary of State Marco Rubio is probably not at the forefront of this. On the Ukraine issue, Rubio is trying to push back the Witkoff-Kushner collusion with the Kremlin. A story I can talk to you about in another podcast if you wish. But you also have all those officials who won't make the headlines, who are in the Pentagon, who are in the intelligence services, who are in the State Department, who are in Treasury, who are part of what is almost an 80-year history of the U.S. working with Europe. So despite the purge of many government officials by the Trump camp, some of those folks are still there. So they're continuing to work with Europe and NATO, for example, continuing to work with European officials in the EU where they can. And they work with individual European countries on the basis not of basically undermining European security, but continuing to try to bolster it. And you and Slovakia know you have a very distinctive position between Russia and the United States and between Russia and the EU. And U.S. officials will be working with Slovakian officials, as well as the EU is, to try to prevent a complete rupture in relations, right? In other words, these U.S. officials are the adults in the room, but they are facing an increasing threat, as the EU is, from, let's call them the far-right faction in the Trump camp. The EU does face that challenge then of the Trump camp, Russia and China, but they do have links, they do have networks. And the question really here is how does the EU, instead of just saying, oh my God, this is terrible, throw their hands up, how they actually try to plan in response to this. So you can talk about this on multiple fronts, but just to introduce a few, if it comes down to Ukraine, despite all this talk of a peace plan, you are not going to get a ceasefire in the near future. I don't think you get a ceasefire until Russia's economy just simply completely starts to crack. And that's not going to happen in the near future. So that means that the European leaders, and again, we saw this on Monday at multiple levels, meeting in London, meeting in Brussels, conference call, you have to plan on bolstering Ukraine's air defenses. You have to plan on maintaining Ukraine's defense on the front line. You have to support Ukraine's energy infrastructure amidst the Russian missile and drone attacks. And you have to support Ukraine's government and public services. And that brings in a whole question of packages, but the immediate ones would be purchasing U.S. weapons to give to Ukraine, and what is this proposal to cover Ukraine's finances for the next 2 years through a combination of the reparations loan based on frozen Russian assets and borrowing on capital markets. And I actually think, despite Belgium holding up and blocking the reparations loan, I think the EU will get there, if not by the end of the year. I think they'll get there by January. This is what you have to do. You cannot count on the United States, except to the extent that you count on the adults in the room in the United States preventing the Trump camp from cutting off the sale of U.S. weapons and cutting off intelligence sharing. So you do that. On a wider front, what you have to talk about is you have to talk about Europe's defense. You have to talk about Europe's defense in terms of planning. This, of course, brings in NATO, but it brings in individual European states. We've seen it especially with Central and Eastern Europe as they're closer to the front line in terms of drone defenses, in terms of rapid reaction planning to Russian threats. It also is not just direct military threats. You have to plan against cyber attacks that the Russians are pursuing and their sabotage operations. And then you have to finance that. And that is the proposal by Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, for an investment of 800 billion euros over 5 years. Now, that's a heavy investment, but you realize that if you can find a way of financing it, it also has a potential boost to the European economy, right? It becomes its own form of almost wartime economy that develops. So Europe has to do all that. Then it has to talk about its relations with other blocs. So, for example, it has to look at China. And I think this is already happening, where you don't look at China as an all-out adversary. You have to balance the threat that China is a competitor and that there are issues of espionage, that there are issues of intelligence matters. You have to balance this versus the need to try to restore trade links. And that does mean that the EU will probably pull back, or at least not mention the issue of Taiwan, and try to get its member states not to mention Taiwan, which happened in recent years. It means that the EU will pull back on internal Chinese matters. Those talks have not gone well with the Chinese. The Chinese are played quite tough, but you're going to see, I think, an increased emphasis on that. The EU also, I'm watching the EU's relations with India. India is looking for trade deals. Paradoxically, because of Donald Trump's chaotic sanctions, which have hit them hard. So the EU has an opportunity, as the UK has already moved to do so, by building up links with India. In other words, Europe has to think of this not just simply being between Moscow, Beijing, and Washington. You have to think of it in a regional and in a global sense. But I come back to the starting point. A lot of EU planning, a lot of European planning has been premised, again, 75 years on we work with the Americans on this planning. You can no longer assume that. You can no longer assume that your medium to long-term planning, let alone your short-term planning, can be premised on working with the White House. There's still some U.S. officials you have to work with, but you cannot make that the starting point for your strategic and your tactical moves.
Scott, you said that what Europe has to do, but I will get some help from Timothy Garton-Ash. He asked in his recent piece for Guardian, he asks two questions. First, can Europe, together with like-minded countries such as Canada, sufficiently strengthen Ukraine and weaken Russia for the former eventually to prevail? And second, feel it? How would you answer them?
Let me make a broader point, because I think you can tell that even at, I think, this is the most challenging time in international relations probably since 1945, not just in Europe, in other parts of the world as well. I still look at half full rather than half empty. If I go back over the past 25 years in terms of what Europe has faced, whether we talk about individual European countries or the EU, as well as what you might consider the positive, which is the expansion of the European community, they've had to deal with the possible rupture with the United States after 9/11 and after the American-led invasion of Iraq and the operations in Afghanistan. So Europe had to deal with that. Europe had to deal with the increasing Russian threat, which took place, remember, not just 2014 in Ukraine. You can go back to Georgia in 2008 and the cyber warfare against the Baltic states back then. Europe's had to deal with the great financial crash or the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, which then threatened the Eurozone. And if you and I were talking more than a decade ago, we'd be saying, would this be a collapse of the Eurozone with countries like Greece and Italy, Portugal, Spain departing? They had to cope with the shock of Brexit and the loss of one of its leading members. They had to cope with the pandemic, and they have had to cope with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I actually think there's an argument to be made, which is the EU is actually in a stronger position in terms of as an organization than it has been in the past 25 years. Now, financially, it's under strain. Economically, it's under strain, but it has had out of necessity to reinforce working together. It has had to deal with certain members, and I'll be very diplomatic in what I say here, certain members who, in fact, have actually worked against the EU project at certain points. And I think I'm particularly looking at Hungary, looking at Viktor Orban, right? It had to deal, not now, I think it's changed, but a few years ago, it had to deal with the threat with Poland. And Poland flouting the EU president. And there are ongoing discussions with Slovakia as well. Let's just be honest about that. And yet the EU has been able to bring to the specific issue of Ukraine, albeit moving too slowly at times, too bureaucratically at times, it has been able to support Ukraine at a time, not only when, let us be clear, Vladimir Putin is dedicated and still dedicated to conquering Ukraine and to undermining Europe. They've had to deal with that this year with the return of Trump to the White House. And Ukraine still stands. Let us be clear that, and again, to make a fundamental point before we get to that question of support, there are a lot of people on social media, well-intentioned, who just go for the dramatic headline and say Russia is winning. In 2022, at the end of 2022, Russia had 18% of Ukrainian territory. In 2025, as I speak to you, Russia occupies just over 19% of Ukrainian territory. So Russia has not made a breakthrough. That has been in large part to the European support to this point. Europe has been the number one supporter of Ukraine financially. It has been probably number two after the United States during the Biden administration in terms of military support, whether you talk about European countries, the EU, or through NATO, treating it that way. What you're asking me and what Timothy Gard-Nash is talking about is can you continue this into 2026?
So what do you think? Can it?
It is not an optimal position. You would want the U.S. in with you on this. But at this point, yes, Europe can continue to do this. Europe can continue to do this for two reasons. One is Europe is a large economic bloc as well. It has a great deal of resources. It has a great deal of industrial manufacturing potential. And it has a will at this point, with the exception of a couple of members, to continue to do this. It has had to do this through 2025 with the Americans to a large part being on the sidelines. But secondly, Europe has been able to work with Ukraine to bring the adults in the room in Washington on board with this. Remember, the Trump administration had cut off intelligence sharing in the spring. They had completely cut off military support, whether it be, not just a question of grants, military grants or loans, but actually selling military weapons to Ukraine. Now, those two decisions were reversed. I do think there's a threat, and it is one that you have to be conscious of, that if Donald Trump gets really, really upset or gets manipulated by the Witkoff-Kushner-Vance faction, he may again demand the cutoff of intelligence sharing, and he may cut off the sale of American weapons to Ukraine. That's going to raise the stakes higher for Europe. But I think you just have to face that when you do. See, Europe, and again, you're quite right. I'm glad you mentioned other partners like Canada, like Australia, in a financial sense, countries like Japan. So this is an international issue as well. Remember, they have leverage on Trump for this issue. Trump does not want to be seen to be in the pocket of Russia. He wants the Nobel Peace Prize, right? And at the end of the day, Zelensky and the Europeans are going to say, you want the Peace Prize, you cease fire on the basis of the current front lines. That, in fact, is where we are right now. I mean, if you want me to just say right now, the defining issue right now is that Vladimir Putin wants all of the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine. Ukraine has just over 20% of it. It will not give up that region through negotiation. You better accept that. Witkoff and Kushner have again, and this has just been leaked in Axios, have again pressured Zelensky to give up the rest of it. And Zelensky and the Europeans are going to say no. And they're going to say, Mr. Putin must accept a ceasefire. Putin is going to reject a ceasefire. He's going to keep attacking Ukraine. What does Trump do then? The international community, including Europe, back Ukraine and saying, that is your red line. That's your red line that the ceasefire crosses. And yeah, I think they can maintain the position, because I'm going to add one other thing, and it's the thing that's left out here. Russia's not in good shape. I'm not saying, because people always exaggerate what I say, I'm not saying the Russian economy is going to collapse. It's never been a question of it collapsing. It's a question of the Russian economy being constrained. You've run an invasion economy now, full-scale invasion economy now for almost 4 years. You're now at the point where Russia's GDP is flatlining. Its inflation, officially, the Russians say it's around 10 to 12%. Well, in fact, they say it's less than 10%, I should say. The LSE, the British University, working with Ukrainian, European partners, is estimating, and this came out in a report this week, the real inflation is around 20 to 25%. Now, if that's true, that means that Russia is also, that flatlining economy is probably contracting. It means real wages are contracting. We know that the Russians have an increasing government budget deficit. We know that they have certain problems in certain manufacturing sectors that they're contracting. I just posted this morning, latest entry on our website, that Russian food production has declined for the first time since 2009. That's because of problems in the agricultural sector, as well as decreasing consumer demand because they're feeling the squeeze. I can walk you through all of this, but what I'm saying here is that the Russian wartime economy by fueling it as a wartime economy, that's running out. And that's combined with the Ukrainian attacks on oil refineries, chemical plants, petrochemical plants, engineering firms, railway hubs, can go through the list, because they are increasingly effective on hitting the Russians. Now, if we get to next spring and Russia still has not overrun Ukraine or forced it to capitulate, does Putin double down and keep this going? And that probably, as an analyst, I don't want to make projections. I don't want to say Russia's going to stop at that point, but that's probably the point I'm looking at is next spring. If Ukraine survives through next spring with the EU, Canada, other countries backing it, can Putin maintain that? And that's before you bring in where we are with the U.S. at this point, whether we have a Trump administration that is fully allied with Moscow, or whether the Europeans and Zelensky, as they have done this year, pull that alliance back by getting to certain officials in the Trump administration and saying, you don't want to be in the Kremlin's pocket.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also the description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.